Good afternoon and good morning from Rome, and welcome to session 2. We will start now session 2 of the SDG 16 conference. My name is Maria-Francesca Spatolisano, and I am the Assistant Secretary General for Policy Coordination and Interagency Affairs at the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs, UNDESA. I am very pleased to welcome the distinguished speakers here in the conference room and those joining us online from different continents. As I said, we will now start session 2. The topic of this session is building institutional resilience and enhancing the effectiveness, accountability, and responsiveness of institutions. 2 years of pandemic have imposed massive stress on societies and institutions and public administrations at all levels, sometimes bringing public services to the brink of collapse. Health systems and education systems were impacted very much, but all public institutions suffered. And this has been observed in countries at all levels of development. This session aims at identifying ways to improve the resilience and the effectiveness of institutions in times of prolonged stress. We will discuss challenges, changes, and innovations made in the delivery of public services in response to the pandemic. We would like to hear about lessons learned and ways forward to increase institutional preparedness and resilience to future crises and risks. And we are keen to learn from advances made to increase collaboration and coordination across levels of government, as well as solutions to enhance transparency and accountability in the public sector during the pandemic and beyond. We will also reflect on whether the pandemic has spurred national reflections on ways to bolster the capacity, professionalism, and effectiveness of public servants who have been central to pandemic responses. To address these issues, we have a stellar panel of speakers. And since we want to hear about all of their experience and views, I would kindly ask speakers to limit their interventions to 5 minutes. We start a little bit late, so I will give immediately the floor to the first speaker. It's my great honor to introduce Ms. Geraldine Fraser-Moleketi, the chair of the United Nations Committee of Experts on Public Administration, and the chancellors of the Nelson Mandela University, who joins us online from South Africa. Dear Geraldine, Ms. Fraser-Moleketi, you have the virtual floor.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Assistant Secretary General, for the opportunity to speak on this, what has now become quite a vexed and challenging question. I want to start out by stating, as you have, that 2020 and 2021 had very clearly pointed to the need for the building of resilient public institutions, for sorry, my apologies. I just want to,
yeah, I think this will allow for a bit of a better link. So 2020, 2021 had clearly indicated the need and importance for public administration and public service. We've heard this as well in the previous session that looked at where we looked in depth at the question of peace building. And as a committee of public service, a committee of experts on public service. We met during this period and over the past week, where we reflected on the fact that there is a need for governments to strengthen their public institutions and their social, physical, and technological infrastructure while making their economies more resilient and agile to be better prepared to manage potential future shock, economic, social, and environmental shocks. But we also clearly acknowledge that for this to happen, it is important for political will, a change in mindsets, and the sound management of public resources. None of the institution building objectives to support the SDGs could be attained without ensuring that COVID-19 has been well contained, while addressing in particular the plight of the poor and vulnerable groups. There was also a deep acknowledgement that there's a need to support the weakest countries and leaving no one behind. And this links to points that were raised earlier around the importance of diversity, trust, and so forth. To this end, governments should effectively cooperate, including on data and information sharing, digitalization, widespread vaccination, and we saw that as the importance on the containment of COVID-19 itself, testing and access to medication, education, and training. There was also the requirement of an exchange of lessons between countries, very clear peer learning exchanges to make this happen. As we deal with this particular issues, we also acknowledge the fact that we may even have seen a loss of opportunity, where in 2020, we saw the centrality of government and the public service in taking forward and dealing with a pandemic. However, there has been a loss of public trust subsequently, and part of this has been linked to a lack of coordination at the center of government across a number of countries, and this is both in the developed and the developing world. We've also seen a situation that coordination at the center and between ministries has not been as good. In our recent meeting, moving off that particular point, what we noted that as we look at the attainment of SDG 16, and as a committee of experts, we say that the principles of public administration has very much been put to the test, and this is around sound policy making, the whole question of intergenerational equity, leaving no one behind, as you pointed out, and the question of transparency that links directly to fiscal and budget transparency. And we saw this as critical, especially in and during crises, whether it was the instance of the pandemic or even in instances of conflict. And of course, looking at non-discrimination and the importance thereof, as well as participation. So we said in essence that these principles had actually been put to the test during the pandemic itself. And we've seen that in countries where there's been greater application, they've dealt with the challenge better. In countries where it's not been that well applied, of course, we have seen different challenges. So I'm going to conclude with one country and also looking more at the municipal, provincial level as well as municipal level, where this was effective. And that is the state of Kerala in India, where they had been able to draw on community structures. So you saw an intervention that came from community upwards, but working very closely with government structures. And this is local government structures as well as provincial government structures. And pulling the required strategic planning and foresight into operation made a major difference. We also see that where the regulatory framework takes into account what the needs are, as in this instance, then it functions better. And I'd conclude with a point that we had in Operation Scene, the promotion of coherent policy making that had led to a response where the citizens were able to benefit, because this is the very same country where in a different part, the impact has been quite different. When we look, for example, at what happened in New Delhi and how, again, the disjuncture around policy and planning has led to problems. I will pause at this point and I'm ready to come back at a later point, either on questions or when an opportunity arises. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you very much. As Ms. Fraser-Moleketi has pointed out, effective and agile institutions and capable public servants are key to a timely and effective response to the pandemic, as in the examples that she just gave us. Resilience to shocks and crises cannot be achieved without coordination at different levels of government. And I would like to invite Ms. Lily Fati Soale, the Director of Finance and Administration of the Ministry of Chieftaincy and Religious Affairs of Ghana, to share her views on the extent to which advances has been made to increase collaboration and coordination across levels of government during the pandemic. Ms. Soale, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. I want to take this opportunity to thank the UNDESA and also the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Italy, and also IDLO for inviting me to this conference. This is my first time of attending this conference, and I am really, really excited to be here to share my experiences and to learn lessons. And I want to start by saying that I agree with a previous speaker was here, and she said that SDG 16 happens to be her favorite SDG. And it is rightly so, because indeed we've been trying, and all nations have been trying to meet their targets of the various SDGs. And it is all, for me, for achieving the SDGs, we need to look at SDG 16 as the pivot around which the other SDGs will revolve. We need strong institutions. If we want to deliver better services to people, we need the institutions, strong institutions, to be able to do that. This issue of having strong institutions and collaborating to be able to enable us deliver the services had been going on. I mean, governments have been trying to collaborate until the COVID hit. We never knew that the approaches we were using were a bit traditional in nature. The COVID-19, I will term it as a wicked problem, which is dynamic and complex and it had no clear definition and no clear solution, thereby defying single response policy responses. As a result, this pandemic brought in its wake a sharp focus and need for coordination of government responses. To this end, different countries have adopted different coordinating mechanisms in varying with varying success. Now, when you look at the various countries and their approaches that they had in terms of collaborating, you realize that there were some conditions that needed to be present, that needed to be there for collaboration to be effective. One of the conditions had to be leadership. Leadership is key when you are embarking on collaboration and coordination of services. Leadership is key, and leadership is linked to trust. If leaders are not transparent, if they are not open, if they are not accountable, it is difficult for citizens to trust them. And where there is no trust, there is not going to be effective collaboration, because it takes the stakeholders or citizens or and then the duty bearers for them to come together to collaborate. Now, the other condition that needed to be there for various countries who were collaborating during this pandemic was the issue of effective communication. Effective communication is linked to inclusiveness. And I think inclusiveness is a term that is already overflowed since we started. We just started the conference, but it is all about inclusiveness, inclusiveness, inclusiveness. Communication is a two-way affair. So I look at it in this aspect of us getting feedback. When we talk about effective communication, we need to ensure that we have we create platforms whereby citizens can always feed back on what their interests are, how services are being rendered to them. So there is a need for this to happen before you can talk about effective collaboration. Then we also need the cooperation of citizens. How governments or the duty bearers alone do not get up and then they're able to coordinate resources or collaborate. They need the citizens to cooperate. Where citizens do not trust governments, where citizens are not interested in the business of the day, they are not going to come on board, and it will be very difficult for us. So for me, these three things are the pillars on which collaboration takes place. Now, let me share with you our experience in Ghana. And I have to admit that if anything has tested the resilience of institutions leading to greater coordination and collaboration in Ghana's recent history, then it is the COVID-19 pandemic. In March 2020, we had our first cases. In fact, it was in February that the first cases were recorded. And the president actually rallied the ministries quickly for us to coordinate our resources and be able to respond to the pandemic. One of the things that, let me just share, because of the time, I'm going to share the lessons that we learned. But one of the things that we put in place was that we ensured that at the local government level, we have sub-structures. We are a unitary state with, at the national level, we have the national government, and then we have local government structures. So at the local government level, we put up together a team, a task force, which was in charge of ensuring that they were in charge of ensuring the implementation of the COVID programs, that activities that we put together. Then we also have guidelines that we use for people, the local government structures, for them to use to guide them in the response to the pandemic. Then also we established public health emergency committees. These public health emergency committees were in charge of creating awareness. There were a lot of myths around the pandemic. Many people thought that it was not even real, and that governments we just brought up some figures so that we could get money funds from the developed countries or our development partners. So the public health emergency committees were put in place to ensure that they coordinated that, and then there was a lot of awareness creation. And then also we ensured that we had consultations with local authorities. We have we have a lot of the chiefs, the traditional leaders. They were very key because they were in every community there's a traditional leader, and so they were at the base of the response, and a lot of coordination went on to ensure that they also played their part. Now we also had to collaborate with a lot of other institutions. Now, in conclusion, I will share with you the lessons that we have that have been learned from our collaborative efforts. One, that we had existing structures. The local government structures were already there and they were very active and robust. Two, we had strong backing from leadership. The president himself was at the forefront, ministers, the directors, and everybody was, the traditional authorities. We had clarity of roles of each stakeholder. There were so many stakeholders on board, religious leaders, and so many of them. So there was the need to clarify rules so that there were no overlaps. And we also had routine reporting and reporting templates and regular meetings. So there was always monitoring to ensure that the response was ongoing and it was being coordinated. Then there was also effective communication that went on, involvement of the authorities, and there were intensive consultations. Now, in conclusion, I would say that it has been observed that collaboration that rises out of problem pressure, such as the pandemic.
Please conclude, please, thank you.
Okay, such as the pandemic could be ad hoc, and it is always hurriedly put in place. So it's always hard work, leading to collaboration fatigue and temptation to revert to traditional approaches once the pressure eases. Indeed, collaboration can only last to such an extent that collaborative mechanisms are institutionalized. Hence, they need to ensure that collaboration is strategic and inclusionary, ensuring maximization of capacities, addressing community expectation, and enhancing staff skills and experience. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for bringing this real life experience and the importance of leadership and trust. I'm sorry for the timing because, you know, we have limited time and others also need to share their experiences. So now, including online people, to talk about the issue of transparency and accountability, which are more relevant than ever before, I'm pleased to introduce Mr. Juan Pablo Guerrero, the Network Director of the Global Initiative for Fiscal Transparency. And Mr. Guerrero joins us online, virtually.
Hello, thank you very much. I am very pleased to be part of this conversation. And I would like to thank UNDESA, IDLO, and the government of Italy for making the GIFT network, for allowing us to make a contribution to your discussion. I also am very pleased to be in the same panel as Gabi Ramos, a very dear friend from university. Gabi, un abrazo. As you know, COVID-19 triggered extraordinary fiscal policy response measures throughout the world. Established public finance regulations were often bypassed at the expense of transparency and reporting timeliness. This hampered efforts to track the design and implementation of budget measures. While fiscal transparency is ultimately the responsibility of governments, civil society organizations and other actors have significant contributions to make. These actors can work together to leverage benefits that cannot be achieved in silos. CSOs undertake research, monitor budget execution, and advocate social justice and inclusion. As they work directly with communities, they often have access to information that other actors do not. CSOs are well positioned to undertake appropriate groundwork in monitoring and advocating access to public services. In times of crisis, civil society can also increase citizens' awareness of key governance and corruption issues, pressurizing governments to respond quicker and more effectively. However, the role played by civil society is often undermined. In 2020, the GIF Network published a scoping document drawing attention to the role of CSOs in emergency policy responses. The value of governments working with civil society has again been highlighted in recent case studies published by the International Budget Partnership. IBP shows that public emergency responses can benefit significantly from a government's willingness to listen to citizens' feedback and respond accordingly. Let me now highlight a few examples. In South Africa, the CSO Asibekelane, Let's Protect One Another, mobilized informal settlement residents to monitor failures in the delivery of critical hygiene services and to report problems to the government for resolution. Their campaign provided timely information to municipal governments, with several then responding positively to meet basic service delivery needs. In Senegal, the government created an inclusive monitoring committee with civil society representatives to gather public feedback on and monitor the implementation of government's fiscal responses to the pandemic. The committee work resulted in practical recommendations, including the establishment of more effective social safety net programs. In the Philippines, CSO reviewed and analyzed information published in fiscal transparency portals to independently monitor COVID-19 fiscal responses, including through the use of a citizen's budget tracker. CSOs also co-designed town hall sessions with government to solicit public inputs on government and budget issues, assist in formulating policy recommendations, and very importantly, monitor their implementation. In Sierra Leone, real-time audits found evidence of financial irregularities. Among others, civil society supported the country's supreme audit institution when the government wanted to override the PFM legal framework. These country examples show that in time of emergency, working with civil society provides for both speedy and informed public decision making and ultimately better public service delivery. To conclude, let me mention some actions that will assist CSO in making effective inputs. One, consistent political commitment to fiscal transparency, even in times of emergency. Two, adding transparency provisions in emergency fund legislation. Thirdly, capacity building of CSO and government officials on the right to access to information and public engagement. Another point is tasking dedicated teams within ministries of finance to implement fiscal transparency measures. And finally, to use open data standards and open data tools that are available in the global community. Gracias por su atención. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Guerrero, for sharing your expertise on the role of transparency and engagement in fiscal responses to the pandemic in all countries.
Which is second from the last.
Similar
Second from last.
challenges in this department. So Now we are a little bit late indeed, and we need to go on quickly. In times of emergency and crisis, it is well known that the risk of corruption is heightened indeed and undermines recovery efforts. In this regard, it is my pleasure to introduce Mr. Giuseppe Busia, the President of the National Anti-Corruption Authority in Italy. Mr. Busia will speak in Italian, and for those who need the interpretation, it is on channel 2. Please, Mr. Busia, tocca a lei, prego.
Per l'invito e grazie di questa occasione di confronto. Grazie per affrontare questo tema così significativo. In tempi di pandemia tutti i paesi hanno risposto alla emergenza con da un lato investimenti notevoli, investimenti pubblici e utilizzo di grandi risorse pubbliche e per sussidiare le persone che avevano bisogno e per fare investimenti pubblici, e dall'altra molto spesso con procedure acceleratorie e derogatorie rispetto alle regole normali. Questo naturalmente accresce i rischi anche che queste risorse da un lato finiscano in mani sbagliate e qualcuno approfitti di queste risorse a svantaggio di altri, e dall'altro che queste risorse comunque vengano spese male e non raggiungano l'obiettivo verso il quale sono dirette. Questo rappresenta un danno e un rischio altissimo, soprattutto in momenti di emergenza. Per tale ragione è importante ed è un prerequisito lavorare proprio nei momenti di emergenza per far sì che sia garantita la trasparenza, la più ampia partecipazione attraverso la trasparenza e la controllabilità dell'uso delle risorse pubbliche. In Italia istituzione che ho l'onore di presiedere, l'Autorità Nazionale Anticorruzione, ha avuto il vantaggio e ha il vantaggio istituzionale di occuparsi non solamente di prevenzione della corruzione, ma anche di promozione della trasparenza, ma anche di vigilanza e controllo sui contratti pubblici, quindi sulla spesa pubblica, che proprio in questo momento è quella che richiede maggiore attenzione. E quello che noi abbiamo cercato di fare e che è opportuno cercare di fare, soprattutto in questi momenti di emergenza, è quello di, da un lato, compensare le procedure acceleratorie e la maggiore velocità con cui è necessario spendere il denaro pubblico e le risorse pubbliche, con iniezioni di maggiore trasparenza, di maggiore controllabilità, e quindi garantire che attraverso la digitalizzazione, ed eventualmente mi soffermerò dopo su questo tema, ci sia maggiore controllabilità su come vengono usate le risorse. E dall'altro cercare di impostare tutte le regole di prevenzione della corruzione in modo tale da indirizzarle verso la buona amministrazione, perché la buona amministrazione e la corretta gestione delle risorse pubbliche è particolarmente importante proprio in questi momenti di emergenza. E allora, infatti, che le regole che non vengono derogate, ma sono che aiutano a rafforzare le istituzioni e contribuiscono a garantire la resilienza delle istituzioni rispetto alle emergenze, manifestano la loro maggiore importanza, perché proprio in questi casi, altrimenti, la corruzione che può capitare, si realizza in questi casi, comporta appunto dei costi estremamente ingenti, sia per i singoli che vengono privati magari dei diritti che loro hanno a ricevere determinati contributi o a determinate posizioni a cui hanno diritto, ovvero la collettività tutta, e naturalmente gli ultimi, i soggetti più deboli, sono i primi a pagare in questi casi. Quello che occorre dunque è che l'emergenza della pandemia, accresciuta purtroppo adesso anche dall'emergenza bellica, ci ha insegnato è che semplificazione e la semplificazione, che pure è necessaria in questi momenti di emergenza, deve essere effettuata utilizzando e selezionando attentamente quali sono gli elementi delle procedure a cui si può rinunciare in nome dell'emergenza, ma senza sacrificare i presidi più importanti di garanzia e di trasparenza e di garanzia delle procedure, perché questi altrimenti, proprio nei periodi di emergenza, finiscono per ricadere sulle persone più deboli, finiscono per accrescere i danni dell'emergenza e quindi accrescono il male generale. Per cui le istituzioni devono avere la forza e la resilienza, applicando le regole ordinarie e derogandovi il meno possibile, di dare una risposta che guarda lontano, che guarda al di là dell'emergenza e che proprio dall'emergenza ha la capacità di apprendere, di imparare la lezione che dalla crisi sempre viene e quindi costruire istituzioni più forti e più robuste. Mi fermo qui per ora e continuerò dopo. Grazie ancora.
Grazie. Apprezzo la brevità. Thank you very much, Mr. Busia, for sharing information on how the pandemic has impacted anti-corruption efforts in Italy, but also how your authority responded to the challenge, and for the brevity, which is appreciated since we are a little bit late. We are now at the end of the first round of interventions by panelists, and we have the opportunity to hear, or rather I will read some of the questions raised from the audience, at least the ones from the Zoom audience. I will read you a question and then I take one from the floor. The question goes this way: has the response to the pandemic led to concrete strategies and plans to strengthen institutional resilience against future shocks? What are the key features of these strategies? Asked Mr. Shadrach Okiere. So the other question I would like to take is from the audience here in the room, if there is a question. If there isn't, we can continue with our set of speakers, and we will hear the response to this question in the next set of speakers. The discussants in this second part will reflect on the first set of interventions and, as I said, address the question. And again, I would like to recall the limit of maximum 5 minutes. And it is my pleasure to introduce now the first speaker, Ms. Sarah Lister, Head of the Governance Bureau for Policy and Program Support of UNDP, who join us from New York virtually. Sarah.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And firstly, I'd like to thank the Government of Italy, UNDESA and IDLO for organizing this SDG 16 conference and for the invitation to participate in the panel, as well as your ongoing partnership on these issues. And I hope my intervention will respond a little bit to what we've heard this morning, both in this session and the first one, and the excellent question that we've just had from the floor, because certainly the dialogue is more important than ever as we look around us at the world and the challenges, which will surely only intensify in the coming months and years, on top of the devastation wreaked by the COVID pandemic. The current pressures on food, energy and finance, as highlighted in the UN Secretary General's recent brief, will likely only serve to increase these challenges and the pressures on governance systems and their institutions. I won't say so much more on the challenges, as there's been a lot of discussion on them and the very troubling trends we see, with multiple indicators going in the wrong direction. But I would like to mention sort of 4 areas that I think we need to pay attention to as we seek to ensure institutional preparedness and resilience to current and future crises and risks. And I hope they respond a little bit to the question that we just heard from the floor. These 4 areas are embedded in UNDP's new forward-looking governance offer, through which we also attempt to mainstream the principles of effective governance, which Geraldine referred to. And we're seeking to mainstream these effective governance principles across all of UNDP's work in all sectors. And I'll go very briefly in the interest of time. Firstly, we need to make better use of the potential of digitalization and innovative technologies to build effective, accountable and inclusive and resilient institutions, but we also need to guard against their potential harms. And we had a lot of experience during the pandemic on supporting governments to roll out new internal digital systems and e-services. Everything from making it easier to internally monitor systems, applied for a passport, to registering a new business. Second, and this has already been mentioned as well, we must take advantages of opportunities of collaboration across national and local governance structures. The pandemic has surely highlighted the need for new multi-level and collaborative approaches to institution strengthening across sectors and across central and local levels. Thirdly, we need to support institutions to become more people-centered, as indeed Geraldine also referred to. This means investing in inclusive governance to boost gender equality, youth engagement, and the participation of marginalized groups. UNDP already has a strong record of supporting institutions to engage with excluded groups while addressing their grievances. In Colombia, for example, UNDP, the Peacebuilding Fund, and others are supporting the Truth Commission's dialogue process, placing the victims, 13% of which are indigenous people, as fundamental political players, not just as those who recount their experiences, but guaranteeing their participation in transitional justice processes. And while another area that we emphasize is that of gender equality, and while there has been some progress on women's representation overall in public administration, persistent gaps remain. Women continue to hit glass ceilings and glass walls that stop them from advancing to positions at the highest levels of power and influence, including in organizations and entities tasked with COVID-19 response. To help spur greater gender equality within governments, UNDP is launching the Gender Seal for public institutions this July to help mainstream gender into public policies. And young people also continue to face closing civic space and exclusion from decision-making and peace processes. And we have supported their engagement in over 100 countries and territories so far, partnering with young peace builders across the globe. My final point, given that institutional building is so highly complex, is that it requires much more reliable financing. Transformational change is a long-term process, and we know that. So there must be increased access to predictable multi-year financing. And UNDP is calling for bold new mechanisms to help low and middle income countries address crippling debt, which has been sharply worsened by the pandemic. Before I wrap up, I would quickly like to draw the audience's attention to 2 new tools that we are launching today to support all stakeholders in their efforts to achieve Goal 16. And I will place a link to them in the chat box when I've finished. Firstly, we are launching the final product of the Global Alliance for Reporting on Goal 16, work with the TAP network, and my colleague will speak shortly on the TAP network. We're launching the e-course on mainstreaming SDG 16 using the voluntary national review to advance peaceful, just and inclusive societies, which provides helpful and practical learning on how to bring Goal 16 to the center of VNR processes. And secondly, we are launching the SDG 16 National Monitoring Initiative Toolkit, which offers guidance, resources, and practical case studies around a 3-step methodology. Both of these tools are available on our Goal 16 hub, and I hope that those of you who are with us today will find them useful in your efforts and in your important work in this area. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ms. Sarah Lister, and both for sharing the lessons learned and the tools you have developed. Now I would like to call on Professor Gostin, who has also a time limit and he has to leave us. So I will call on Professor Lawrence Gostin, the faculty director at the O'Neill Institute for National and Global Health Law of Georgetown University, to make his intervention also virtually. Professor Gostin, over to you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm very pleased to be with you. I'm going to discuss 3 things. One, what is good governance? When an institution governs well, what are the characteristics? Secondly, I'll talk about strengthening one particularly important global institution, the World Health Organization, that's been leading the pandemic response. And then finally, I'll briefly cover the issue of how there have been deep inequities and injustices in the COVID pandemic. So I'll try to do all that in 5 minutes. Good governance, as we've heard from our first panel, involves several key features. The first one, of course, is transparency, so that all information, all policies are always out in the open and clear, and that there's open sharing of information. I think that's critically important. Secondly, there needs to be mechanisms of accountability. People have to be accountable for their successes and their failures, and there has to be a good, clear charge so that we can measure outcomes and successes, or the lack of success in progress. And then thirdly is inclusiveness. And this is one where many UN agencies tend to fail because they're intergovernmental organizations. That would include an important civil society role, not just in having access to various fora, but also to be deeply involved in the governance of the institution. Places like the Global Fund or the Gavi Alliance, for example, include civil society in their governance structures. Secondly is the World Health Organization. The World Health Organization, of course, has to abide by all these good governance principles that I've mentioned, and they haven't always. So we must push, as friends of WHO, them to do better, particularly in the area of inclusiveness. But WHO has been a great leader, a moral conscience. Dr. Tedros has been a moral conscience during this pandemic. But at the same time, WHO is, its inabilities to act have been clear. For example, got caught in a politically divisive fight between the two world's great superpowers. Early on in the pandemic, it was unable to gain accurate information about the outbreak in Wuhan, and subsequently to have an independent and rigorous investigation into the origins of SARS-CoV-2. And the WHO has been handicapped by the lack of financing and powers. So as a result, there are 3 major initiatives that are ongoing at WHO, which could be transformational. I really think we need to look at this pandemic and turn this crisis into a transformational reform. The three reforms WHOers are conducting, which I'm involved in, one is critically important, which is sustainable financing, to try to have at least 50% of its annual budget non-earmarked and compulsory assessed dues by governments. At the moment, WHO has control only of about 20% or less of its budget, and that's unsustainable. At the same time, WHO's budget is about the same size of a large US teaching hospital, so it's wholly incommensurate with its global mandate. The second initiative is reform of the international health regulations, which are the governing instrument of WHO and of pandemic response and preparedness. And the third is the most audacious, which is an international agreement or a pandemic treaty that would give WHO new powers to prevent, prepare for, and to respond to future health emergencies. Most importantly in all of this is the issue of equity. The SDGs, if they stand for anything, they stand for not leaving anyone behind. But even before the COVID pandemic, we've had gaping inequalities, unconscionable inequalities, which were the prevailing global narrative. Now with COVID, these inequalities have been exacerbated. They've been exacerbated based upon income, gender, race, socioeconomic status within countries and among countries, with poor people dying at disproportionate rates from COVID, and also the literally jaw-dropping inequity of the allocation of life-saving medical resources, in particular vaccines, but also diagnostics, therapeutics, and also vaccine infrastructure that we've seen around the world. WHO anticipated these inequities and formed the ACT Accelerator and the COVAX initiative, but these have simply not been up to the task. So in future governance, what is crucial is we pay attention to those who've been left behind, and we have mechanisms to ensure that never again we will see the kinds of injustices that we've seen during COVID-19. I wish I had more time, but thank you very much for joining me and for having me join you. And also my sincere apologies for having to leave. I have another urgent engagement that I have to get to now. Thank you and good evening to you.
Thank you, Professor, for sharing your analysis and information on good governance, the WHO, and of course, persisting and exacerbated inequalities and the importance of inclusiveness. I now would like to go back to the topic of corruption. We heard about a perspective from the national level, and now let's hear about a global perspective. It's my pleasure to introduce Mr. Thomas Stelzer, the Dean of the International Anti-Corruption Academy, who was also my predecessor in the UNDESA, the Department of Economic and Social Affairs. Over to you, Thomas.
Thank you very much, Maria-Francesca. It's so good to be back and supporting my old good DESA in this conference together with our partner IDLO in this SDG 16 conference. Of course, SDG 16 is the central SDG by providing the structural framework, the parameters of good governance, which will allow for the implementation of the 15 content SDGs. It's really central. And as we know that 3 of the targets of SDG 16s are anti-corruption related. So the fight against corruption in the framework of Agenda 2030 becomes the cross-cutting agenda. And while we struggle to raise the money to implement the SDGs by helping governments increase their tax revenue in the hope that some of this revenue will be channeled towards SDG implementation, we're witnessing this enormous illicit financial flows, tax evasion, tax avoidance, bribery, and corruption, siphoning trillions of dollars out of productive economies, which cannot be compensated for, neither by direct investments, nor by ODA, nor by remittances. This money is missing. So very obviously, success in the fight against corruption becomes a precondition for raising the money to implement the Agenda 2030. And of course, in the post-COVID crisis, this becomes even more alarming and more amplified because corruption thrives in crisis. While countries mobilize to save lives, and speed often was prioritized over transparency, which allowed convict criminals and individuals take advantage of rushed procurement procedures and funds with little oversight in place. So corruption undermines, of course, all aspects of human development. It poses a threat to peace and security, undermines institutions, and jeopardizes sustainable development and the rule of law. Now, anti-corruption, we're in a radical position right now. With the implementation of the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, which is a global instrument adhered by nearly all the United Nations countries. This instrument provides us with the legal base for the first time ever to fight corruption globally on the basis of the rule of law, excluding impunity. If we manage to implement this convention globally, and this is the job of my organization. The International Anti-Corruption Academy is the only international organization focusing holistically on the fight against corruption as an institution of higher learning, trying to offer technical assistance to practitioners, to lawyers, prosecutors, judges, judicial personnel, everybody who works in the field of anti-corruption to understand the complex regulations of the convention better and to implement them. This has also been taken up by the recent special session of the General Assembly, UNGAS, last year, which concluded and highlighted the area of education in the context of technical assistance. Our organization, we are not yet United Nations, we are outside organizations trying to add value to what the international system is providing in the fight against corruption. But we were requested to strengthen our relations with the United Nations system and of course with the UNODC in Vienna, the guardian of the convention, which we complement with our work. In the context of COVID, and I try to be very concentrated here, we draw several lessons here. First, effective anti-corruption measures and preparedness save lives in crisis situations. Significant loss of life could have been avoided during the pandemic had there been better governance and anti-corruption measures in place. Petty bribes were used to avoid quarantines. Ventilators and other medical equipment were the subject of corrupt transactions, leading to the loss of lives and those in need. Anti-corruption preparedness is key to ensuring effective early response to crisis. Lesson 2, investing in anti-corruption education is crucial to building a fit-for-purpose workforce and promoting a culture of integrity. To fight corruption, we must provide our practitioners and frontline workers with the tools they need. Consider political economic capital in anti-corruption education and training will be required to build necessary capacities in both the public and private sectors to foster a culture of integrity in societies. Lesson 3, partnerships and international cooperation are vital for tackling corruption and the pandemic. Neither the pandemic nor corruption can be detained within national borders. We need strong international cooperation, robust international institutions, and monitoring mechanisms. Governments, international organizations, civil society, citizens must work together to find collective solutions and jointly build a society free of corruption. And a last fourth lesson, which I would like to highlight here, is the COVID pandemic has substantially changed education. By denying us the opportunity to offer education in person and to translate our content on a virtual level, we have transformed education, of course, which gives us new opportunities. Like my organization, we had to go virtual, but that allowed us also to dramatically upscale our diffusion capacity, reaching out to many more people who can benefit from our products and opening new opportunities to mainstream anti-corruption into society. Now I stop here and I'm looking forward to your questions and viewpoints on what I've touched upon here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stelzer, for your insights on fighting corruption and lessons learned. And now we go virtual again, and we have the pleasure to hear from Gabriela Ramos, the Assistant Director General for Social and Human Science at UNESCO. Gabriela, it's about, of course, your experience at UNESCO with education gains which have been wiped out because of the COVID pandemic, but also other initiatives taken by UNESCO. I understand. Gabriela, you have the floor. Thank you for being with us.
Well, those things I have already started, and I was muted. I was just saying that it's a great pleasure to be here with you. Thank you, Maria-Francesca, and also thank you to the government of Italy, to UNDESA, to IDLO, and great to see Juan Pablo there. Long time no see. Indeed, as many of the speakers have mentioned, the COVID pandemic has been a litmus test for governments to continue operating, to face the pandemic, but also to test the capacities. I have to say that at the beginning, we all perceived how much they were ill-equipped to deal with the size and the impact. Even the most advanced economies lacking equipments, lacking beds, lacking the health systems that had been managed with this mantra of efficiency, proving the downsides of that kind of management. But I have to say that the pandemic also has shown, and this is quite interesting, the capacity to innovate by governments. In many governments around the world, of course, this has to do with those that have the fiscal space, but even those countries that rely, for example, on conditional cash transfers, were able to use those tools that were not developed in the context of a crisis, but to reach out to those that were really left behind or the most vulnerable. So I feel that we need to comment and we need to learn. So I welcome this opportunity on what can we keep from these very good innovations that we perceive in the public sector. Education, of course, a great impact. And it also showed how important it was to have the infrastructure, to get the digital infrastructure, because it was pretty obvious that it was not going to be able to keep learning going, as my friend Stefania Giannini from the education sector said, if you didn't have the digital infrastructure. And that really, it was a wake-up call in terms of the need to continue investing and reaching out to those areas that are really lagging behind to bring the services. Is not enough, and I have to say that that was also one of the learning issues here at UNESCO in the education front, and in the very impressive Global Coalition for Education that was put up for dealing with these issues, because you also need to train the teachers. You need, I mean, the technologies by itself will not deliver, and I think that we need to look at those that were not able to connect. 1.5 billion students at some point were curtailed from education services. And now we have, unfortunately, those that are really in the weakest situation, 11 million girls that are not going to come back. And that's one of our worst concern. But the other part is that the digital services also expanded. And we know that artificial intelligence just got skyrocketed because of the track and trace, because we needed to deliver the services without using, without being able to connect or to see each other. And therefore the developments in artificial intelligence really expanded massively. I would say that we would not have ever got a vaccine if we didn't have the capacities of artificial intelligence in just 1 year, when the average for vaccine development is around 4 to 8 years. And we would not have, again, deal with the education or deal with work and deal with so many issues that even telemedicine that was delivered not for COVID cases, but also for all the other services. So the digital economy, the digital transformation expanded and increased importantly. And this is an area that I wanted to share with you, because this is what we have been doing here in the social and human science sector at UNESCO. During the last 2 years in COVID, we were advancing an instrument, a global instrument on the ethics of artificial intelligence to align the development of these technologies to respect of human rights, to ensure transparency, to ensure explainability, to ensure accountability. And it's not only about the platforms. I mean, the platforms, you governments regulate them. The question is how much governments are also using and having now a lot of information that was gathered because of the pandemic, but that we need now to discuss issues of privacy and how do we go back to normal times whenever the situation is controlled. And therefore, this global standard that we developed with 193 countries approving it in November is delivering these elements of the regulatory systems and how do we frame them to align them with human rights, and also how the policies need to be developed to protect us from the downsides, the discriminatory outcomes, the bias algorithms, the fact that 85% of all AI developments are done by male-only teams, and therefore no wonder why gender issues are not so visible, or girls or women are not so present in that industry. Very last point, what did we learn? Yes, we need agile governments, but we need learning institutions, and we need the capacity to learn. We need to anticipate, we need resilience, not only effectiveness, but also resilience. And we need to think about futures literacy, which is another angle that we do here at UNESCO. We need capable public servants that understand what they're doing. But I also would say we need governments that engage with people. Civil society, I agree with Juan Pablo, they really deploy all the force. We launched a major initiative for youth as researchers, 10,000 youth telling us what they think, and then getting together with policymakers so we do not assume that we know what people need, but hear it from them. And then gender, because I think that if there was one big casualty of this crisis, is that we had few gender lens policies. And I hope that all the recovery packages will make up for that, to have really a gender lens and address the issues of women that really face more dire straits in this context. But thank you so much for the invitation. I'm happy to be here with you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Ramos, dear Gabriela, for being with us and stressing the need for enhancing the resilience of education systems and bridging, of course, the digital divides. I will then go to the last of this set of speakers, Mr. John Romano, the coordinator of the TAP network, the Transparency, Accountability and Participation Network. Mr. Romano, you have the floor, and thank you for being patient and waiting.
Great, thank you very much. And I think the benefit of coming last is that I can skip all the background that I had here and just agree with everything that's been said so far. So I'll get straight into the details for my 5 minutes. I think one thing that we've seen through the COVID-19 pandemic and something that's become clearer as time goes on is that the pandemic or crises like the pandemic are really only just exposing the cracks that had already existed within societies to begin with, and really exposing and deepening those cracks. And I think, I don't want to touch on all the issues that civil society has been faced with in the face of the COVID-19 pandemic. I'll save that for the next session, where we'll detail the Rome Civil Society Declaration on SDG 16+, has tons of information about how civil society has been affected and how it's been building resilience in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. But I want to touch on a few points related to this. I think this might sound somewhat obvious. The SDGs are voluntary in nature. They're non-legally binding, but SDG 16+ is in fact not optional for governments to implement. I mean, governments have already made commitments to SDG 16+ in their constitutions or laws or policies. It's at the core of why governments even exist, and how they deliver results for people. So I think realizing this and thinking about instead of, how do we apply SDG 16+ at the national and local level, I think thinking about it from the other way is, how do local governments or civil society grassroots groups contribute to national implementation and overall as a global picture, which is not a good picture of progress at the moment. I could go into detail on a lot of concrete ways that civil society has built resilience, responding to the question from the audience. But I think that would take too much time. Instead, I just have a couple of really concrete resources and tools that we've put together as the TAP network. The first is actually a resource that we launched just the other day with UNDP. Called the Mainstreaming SDG 16+ resource. This is an online e-learning course. You can find it, it's really simple to find, mainstreamingsdg16.org. That really provides some insight into how governments and institutions can integrate SDG 16+ into their planning processes, implementation of, even if you're not a champion government on SDG 16+, how do you still ensure that SDG 16+ is, integrated into the implementation of all of the other SDGs? And then the second resource that we have is called the SDG 16+ Civil Society Toolkit. And this is a resource guide for civil society colleagues, particularly those that work at the national and local levels, to help them think through how to integrate SDG 16+ into their own work. Again, really simple to find. It's just sdg16toolkit.org. So I think somewhat related to that, I think it's important for us, again, to think about things from the localization perspective. I think simply put, if we fail to include or governments or institutions fail to include civil society at the grassroots level, I think we are inevitably doomed to fail in implementing SDG 16+, and there's plenty more in the Rome Civil Society Declaration that we'll outline in this next session. And so the final point I wanted to make was, related to one really profound impact that has been seen from the COVID-19 pandemic. And that's related to the point that's been mentioned many times so far today, related to funding, and particularly related to support for grassroots groups and organizations within civil society. We've seen a shift in budgets towards the COVID response and recovery efforts. And that's taken quite a bit away from, donor aid budgets, development budgets, supporting civil society. And we know that civil society colleagues are on the front lines of response and recovery to the COVID-19 pandemic. The question is, why are we not funding our colleagues at the grassroots level to actually take on that work? So that's a huge gap for us going forward. And so I think one thing, similarly, we're seeing related to militarization, military budgets, which, let's be honest, are at absurd levels to begin with. how do we make sure that we're not overfunding these things and instead investing in grassroots groups? So one recommendation from the Rome Declaration is to establish a global SDG 16 plus fund, which we hope will help stem the tide of this funding that's being funneled away from civil society and grassroots groups, and also to help provide more equitable access to funding for grassroots organizations, which often struggle a huge amount in actually accessing funding from donor governments. We also know that funding is siloed. Donors have their own priority issues. So the question is, how do we ensure that we're getting out of those silos, and how do we ensure that we're connecting colleagues working on these different issues? We always say that SDG 16 plus is linked with all other SDGs. How do we support colleagues at the grassroots level that know this in reality? They see this on a daily basis. How do we make sure that that's actually implemented in practice? So we think that a fund, an SDG 16 plus fund, can also help us break down silos, not just within civil society, but again, coming from the grassroots level to the local, to the national level, and then eventually at the global level. So again, we've heard this call many times today. I really hope that this can be a catalyst for something like this. Let's take this forward, hopefully. And again, there's much more that we'll present in the Rome Declaration in this next session. So I'll just leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we have concluded this set of panelists, but like earlier, I would like to take one question from our virtual audience. And we have a question from a young person from Belgium who asks an interesting question. Is there still momentum to use open government data to combat corruption? Can this help citizens demand greater accountability from the public sector? And this question, of course, resonates with many of the things we've heard. I would like now to give the floor again to our panelists to share one or two final thoughts or recommendations in light of our discussion and the questions you heard. And this time I would be even more limited and give everybody 1 minute each. I would start, and we will alternate virtual and in-person questions, interventions. And I would like to invite Geraldine, Miss Geraldine Fraser-Moleketi, if she is with us, to take her 1 minute final time.
Thank you very much. I am online. In this, I'll raise three things. Firstly, I'd want to recognize Sarah. Good to see you, Sarah. And I think it's really heartening to see that the SEPA principles are being integrated into the UNDP strategic plan. This very clearly talks about the integration that ECOSOC is committed to across agencies as well as commissions and so on going forward. The second issue that I heard very strongly is the importance of social compacting, much as that word wasn't heard, because this is talking about the interface between government, private sector, and civil society. So I'm talking about public sector, private sector, and civil society, and the range of agencies that and sectoral partners that have to play a role. Of course, there will be different stakeholders in different communities or countries and so on. The third issue, and this is the last issue that I'd want to emphasize, that what we've reflected upon today is the reality that public administration and public service is still operating in silos. And we see this across the various spheres of government, whether it's at the subnational and national government level, provincial level, level or federal as well as national level, and we need to overcome those silos. And financing, of course, was raised, and the centrality of SDGs. I've concluded because I think it is the end of.
Thank you, Geraldine, and now for your reflections. And now let me give the floor to Miss Fati Soale, who is here with us in the room. Please.
Thank you very much. In conclusion, I would like to draw our attention to the issue of mainstreaming collaboration. Post-pandemic, what do we do? I just discussed how Ghana were able to rally around, put all the actors together to achieve success. But the worry is, after this, what next? We have to look at, one, professional staff. We need to really build capacities. We have to enhance capacities because it takes professional staff to be able to implement all the strategies that we will come out with from this important conference. So one, the key thing is inclusiveness. Then the next thing is building capacities. So I will conclude by saying that I just hope that we will be able to consolidate all our strategies that we have adopted so far and we are going to adopt. Let's not forget about citizens' demand for accountability. We cannot just talk about inclusiveness. Let's include citizens when they are not ready to be included. So what can we do to ensure that citizens are also interested and are ready to be included in all these endeavors that we are trying to undertake? Thank you very much. I'll be very brief. I don't want to see what happened is. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And next, I would like to invite Ms. Juan Pablo Guerrero, who is with us virtually, to
Gracias.
1 minute considerations, please.
Thank you. 2 points very much related to the previous points made. Transparency that is not used is useless. And in order to make sure that information that governments provide to the public is used, you absolutely need to talk to the users. Governments very rarely speak to the information users. So when we talk about transparency, I would emphasize the need of having government speaking to civil society organizations and civil society in general, specific audiences, youth, women, children, and others, whoever is receiving that information, to make sure that the information that they provide is meaningful. And the other side of the coin, of course, is that when we talk about accountability, when we talk about access to information, we need to train civil society, of course, but more importantly, we need to train public servants. How many times do we teach civil service to be accountable? Very rarely. So again, for capacity building in public participation, transparency, and accountability, there also need to be work with public servants. Thank you very much again for the opportunity.
Thank you. Now it's my pleasure to give the floor to Mr. Giuseppe Busia, who is in the room in person.
Grazie ancora. Brevissimamente, abbiamo parlato di digitalizzazione, occorre, perché abbia reali benefici, che si accompagni a una reingegnerizzazione di quello che facciamo. La mera traslazione sul digitale non basta, e quindi, lo diceva prima una domanda, l'esempio che noi possiamo portare è quello di una banca dati in cui noi raccogliamo tutti i dati del public procurement, degli acquisti pubblici. In tempi di pandemia sono cresciuti, applicando tecniche di intelligenza artificiale, come veniva detto, serve a combattere la corruzione, ma dobbiamo pensarla anche per offrire servizi alle imprese e servizi alle pubbliche amministrazioni. Seconda cosa rapidissima, la qualificazione del lato pubblico e del lato privato è essenziale e noi dobbiamo pensarla sia sul lato dell'organizzazione, laddove nel pubblico ci sono centri di competenza, devono essere messi al servizio delle altre amministrazioni, e allo stesso tempo e soprattutto dobbiamo formare le persone, aiutare le persone ad avere competenza, perché la chiave di volta è la competenza e la coscienza e la cultura della legalità e della buona amministrazione che devono coordinarsi, e soprattutto in tempi di pandemia sono la chiave di volta perché le risorse utilizzate diano il loro frutto, superino le crisi e soprattutto costituiscano basi per un futuro solido nel lungo periodo. Grazie, grazie ancora per l'invito.
Grazie a lei. And now I would like to invite Ms. Sarah Lister to speak online.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to pick up two points quickly. One is in relation to the mainstreaming of the use of the SEPA principles, which Geraldine mentioned, and just a reflection that the COVID pandemic, I think, has opened the opportunity to have that conversation in a new way. And we see a demand for a very detailed and significant conversation about governance principles in terms of delivery, in a way that in the decades I've been working in the governance space, perhaps we have always, some of us have felt we needed to fight our corner. I don't think that's the case now. I think that there is an openness, there's a recognition, there is public demand in a way we have never seen before for accountable, inclusive and effective governance principles to be mainstreamed across other sectors. And that's an important space that we need to be in a position to push forward. And then I just want to pick up the data question very quickly that somebody posed in the chat. And we haven't talked so much about this, but the issue of data, I think, is absolutely critical and typically underfunded. And here I want to acknowledge Geraldine's contribution in supporting this area for a long time, and note that we now have much better tools and definitions and capacities to be measuring goal 16 and governance data and collecting governance data, nationally owned governance data, than we did 10 or 15 years ago. The field has advanced enormously. We now have I've been working across the UN system and with other partners to have a goal 16 module, which can be a household survey attached to other survey instruments at the national level. And we have been training thousands of national statisticians on this tool. So there are capacities to be using data in ways for governance that we did not have before. And again, that's an opportunity. And of course, there's a range of other data that is also important, civil society data and so forth. So we haven't talked so much about that, but I do think that that is an issue that is very important as we look at strengthening institutions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to give the floor now to Thomas Stelzer, please.
Thank you. Transparency and access to information are preconditions to fight corruption, no doubt. So protection of whistleblowers, education of investigative journalists are important parts of our work. We know that the more transparent society is, the less prone it is to corruption. So transparency in government, in society, these are worthy goals. I would like to refer to one third item here, which is beneficial ownership. In the present discussion of sanctions, of how do we trace assets of oligarchs, it becomes very obvious that very complex constructions are very often used to hide ownership. So beneficial ownership registries are definitely something we have to implement to fight corruption efficiently. Thank you.
Excellent points. Thank you. And we conclude this round with Mr. John Romano. Please, your 1 minute considerations.
Great, thank you. I mean, 2 points really. The first is on, we need to invest more in non-official data sources. So data sources that come from outside of government and national statistical offices, and instead from civil society or academic institutions. And I think also investing more in survey data, perception, and experiential data. I mean, if we're not taking the opportunity to ask people how they're experiencing progress, I think it's a huge missed opportunity for us to hold governments accountable and for governments to be more responsive to people in their own countries. And then the second point is related to how we communicate this data, which I think is a huge challenge. How do we, data is really only as useful as the narrative that you craft around it. So for data nerds, it might make a lot of sense, but how do we communicate this to a broader audience and bring more people on board, supporting the SDGs or whatever it may be? So I think that's a huge challenge for us to consider going forward, is not just collecting the data, but how do we communicate it better as well?
Thank you all. We have lost, unfortunately, 2 of our panelists for other commitments they had. So this is this was the last speaker of this panel. It's been a very rich and informative session, I think, and I would like to thank you all for your contributions. There is one thing I won't try to summarize now, because we have a session where we will report to the plenary about the substance of it. But there is one thing I've learned today, and that is that 5 minutes are too short to do justice to the rich variety of experiences we've made during this pandemic in ways to build resilience and enhancing effectiveness, accountability, and responsiveness of institutions. Before we leave, I would like to invite you to another more important, as important event, and that is a presentation, because now we will hear from civil society who will introduce the 2022 Rome Civil Society Declaration on SDG 16 plus, and I invite the representatives of civil society to join the podium for this last part of our afternoon. And I thank you all the panelists. Thank you.